Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCullum, and today I am happy to be joined by two very cool people. We have on the far end Nic Jenzen-Jones from Ares, Armament Research Services, and we have Jonathan Ferguson from what is colloquially known as the Pattern Room Collection, which is actually now the National Firearms Centre here at the Royal Armouries. That's quite a lot of different organizations, isn't it?
It's true.
Can you tell us in a brief moment what is... I think everyone in the United States thinks of this place as the Pattern Room, but nobody over here thinks of it as the Pattern Room anymore.
That's the problem.
Tell us, what is the difference?
Okay, so where we are right now, the core of that collection is what we call the former Pattern Room collection.
Okay.
So the collection still exists. We've saved it, preserved it, however you want to look at it. But it's a subset of the existing and even more ancient Royal Armouries collection.
Okay, so the Pattern Room was the Ministry of Defense, basically their gun collection. Their set of literally sealed patterns, which is the guns that served as the standard for manufacturing. And then also all the guns that they got for trials over the course of, like 150 years?
That's right. The two collections grew in parallel.
Okay.
The Armoury started at the Tower. Indeed, we still have our site at the Tower of London, the displays there. That was an issuing arsenal. It was also where guns were usually set up or assembled rather than manufactured, but nonetheless a manufacturing centre. And in the 19th century, production substantially, or assembly as well, moved to the Enfield factory in North London.
Okay.
That facility then started its own parallel collection aimed at servicing more contemporary needs, but it also became an historic collection.
Okay, and now you've assembled all of that here together into the coolest gun collection, basically in the Western Hemisphere.
I like to think so. Last count, we have 26,003 firearms.
And that's not actually really the relevant detail, I think. I think what's important is the quality of the guns that are here. There's a tremendous amount of stuff here that simply exists nowhere else.
That's fair to say.
Certainly primarily British military firearms, but tons of stuff. This collection was gaining guns through World War I and World War II. Every time there was a conflict that the British military was involved in, they'd bring back interesting stuff that they found and add it to the collection here. So now there's all sorts of cool stuff.
And the Tower collection takes us back to about 1400 AD. The modern collecting activity brings us up to the present day with polymer-bodied firearms. So, yeah.
We'll get to this in a moment. Now, Nic, you're also here because this isn't, well, certainly you're interested in both modern and historic firearms as well, but some of your recent work has been on what you describe as improvised and craft-produced firearms.
Yeah, look, I mean, not just my work personally, but the work of the company more broadly. We've had quite a lot of interest from a range of different actors on what are these things, what are the difference between so-called improvised and craft-produced firearms, how are they made, how widespread are they globally, how frequently are they used in current and recent conflict, what benefits or drawbacks do they offer the users, including criminal groups, non-state actors, and so on. So we started by trying to get through some of the language. Both those terms, improvised and craft-produced, have been used for a long time. You also hear, of course, things like DIY or scratch-made or locally produced. There's a lot of different terminology floating around. We've tried to draw a distinction between improvised firearms that are very simple and require the minimum amount of skill and also machine tools to produce. So that's a great example. So is this pipe shotgun, slam shotgun here.
Yes, and this stick with a cartridge case wired to it.
That's about as basic as you get.
Spoilers.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll get to this in a moment. But of course, I do want to point out that the collection here has a lot of this type of material because it's not just military. You're also involved with the police on a really kind of a daily basis.
It's not something we can go into details about, but yeah, the Pattern Room, the Pattern Room had these responsibilities to government over and above the museum work that we do, and we still do that kind of thing. But the two overlap in that we aim to preserve these things not only for contemporary reference for those that need it, but for the future as well.
Fantastic. So let's take a look at what are some of these. We've got this whole selection of interesting improvised and craft-produced weapons. Nic, you want to start us off on what are
I think you've picked up the obvious starting point already. I think that's an interesting number. It's I mean, it's fashioned from a piece of wood, a cartridge case, a 23mm cartridge case, I think. No, sorry, a 20mm cartridge case, and
some baling
some
wire.
wire. Yeah, it's about as basic as you get, and someone's bashed a hole into the top that you can use to ignite your propellant charge.
Yeah, it's become a matchlock.
It is a very basic muzzleloader, exactly right.
Not even that.
No, it's not a matchlock. No.
It's a big lock.
Yeah, quite possibly.
It's what I would call a handgun.
And it's, I think, from the Mau Mau insurgency, I believe.
This one is actually Greek Cypriot.
Oh, is it? Okay. Right.
Sorry, Aoka.
Aoka, yeah.
Terrorists.
So I know a lot of these were fashioned in the Mau Mau
They were.
uprising. That's where I think there's a couple of photos floating around from the Imperial War Museum and other sources that are quite well known.
Yep.
This is in the same vein, and that's sort of, I guess, the very low end of the scale of what we see produced as improvised weapons, and then you move up into things such as the slam fire shotgun, for example.
So I know some of this sort of thing has actually been produced commercially in the United States for a short time.
Yeah, based loosely off some Filipino designs that were sort of brought back by American servicemen. Yeah.
So what is this? Go ahead, tell us.
I mean, it's as simple as it looks. It is one piece sleeved within the other, a fixed firing pin at the rear, and ideally a chamber size that correlates with something you have on hand. So in this case, probably a 12-gauge shotgun cartridge.
Looks like a 12-gauge.
That's the most common design. And a fixed firing pin in the rear, and you simply pull one bit very quickly back into the other. That's as good as it gets. Yeah, boom. That's it. You've figured it out. So you can see that obviously they're pretty basic at one end of the spectrum. Of course, at the other end, they start to become quite involved and complex. I think Jonathan probably is well placed to speak about this.
Just reach over and grab that. Maybe rest that one down.
Yeah. Give you a clear field of view there.
So we have received various weapons from the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and this is one of them. This has been published. You can read up details on that. There are relatively few details about these things, partly because they've not been passed to us. That's not relevant. But the variety is striking with these things. Most of the SMGs are loyalist terrorists rather than IRA. Indeed, this is. I'm not quite entirely sure why that's the case, except that I guess the other side had other ways of getting original purpose, lethal purpose firearms. So the loyalist terrorists had to make do and mend, as we say in Britain, and they made all sorts. There are Sterling variants, there are Sten-based things like this, and there are what they call nicknamed Stenlings, which are a sort of hybrid of the two.
Okay.
We have examples of most of those. This one was named, I presume, this was gathered in interrogation or something, but the Avenger, which I'm not going to go into any politics, but that's what it was called. Right away, people will probably notice 303 on this. Clearly not the caliber.
Right.
We believe that's an attempt at a serial number, probably artificially high to conceal the fact that not many were made. Who knows? It is absolutely standard blowback operated, except that it has a it's non-functional, I should add, semi-telescoped bolt, which wraps around the back end of the barrel, a bit like an Uzi or any other design that uses that feature.
Impressive.
Yeah, it is actually impressive. Yeah. Also, a rather unusual recoil, which I can't show you unfortunately without taking it apart, which I'm wary of doing. Recoil spring mounted in the front.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you look in the back, you can see there is no spring, and yet there's very clearly spring tension.
There's that. Buffer. That's a buffer. That's exactly what that is. The recoil spring, return spring, is hidden in here. So it is actually relatively unusual, but it's working on the same principle.
Or at the moment failing to work.
Failing to work, it is broken, yeah.
It's on the side.
Thank you. Sten type magazine. In fact, it is a Sten magazine, if I can get it out.
Yeah, it's interesting to note that a lot of these craft-produced weapons often use some original purpose parts. Magazines especially, because as we all know, they're notoriously difficult to produce reliable magazines.
That's right. In fact, the main thing about the Stenlings is that they are often Sten primarily, but the magazine they were built around a Sterling magazine because it's so good.
Right. The Sterling magazine is one of the best submachine gun magazines ever made.
Yep. This is not. They're using a Sten mag, so who knows what sort of malfunctions they may have had with this. A couple of other interesting features. One One is this.
Oh, that's interesting. I was looking at that folding stock and didn't realize the front grip was the butt stock.
Rather Gucci, as they say in the British Army. This locks into the front as a foregrip, as you rightly say. Pull down, swing out, and it will lock into place.
Wow.
Yeah.
As quite a serviceable shoulder stock.
Yeah. Huh.
With 2 struts.
And it appears to be reasonably... it's a little wobbly, isn't it?
It's not amazing, but
it's better than an MP40 stock.
Folding stocks are typically wobbly. Yeah. And the other obvious elephant in the room here that I haven't talked about is this suppressor. Now, the story goes, and how this was obtained, this is all the public domain information, was because of this. Because some sort of contract was put in place with some sort of air container manufacturer. And someone got wind of that and traced the weapon from that. It was meant to be a sort of industrial muffler.
Yeah, you can see this is not like a tube with some caps welded on it. That was professionally factory made.
Yep. Sealed unit with something going on in there. It's quite hard to see.
Not coming apart, yeah.
No. So they would have put in an order of how, presumably quite a few.
Yeah.
Even if they didn't have that many guns to fit them to. And obviously the barrel is threaded to accept it.
No, they were certainly running workshops and producing production line style manufacturing in some of these areas.
Yes, again, without going into details that I'm not even privy to, work was done, in the evenings by guys that were employed by legitimate companies. Right. So they were using machine shops to make.
It's interesting to note these rack numbers. We see these sorts of attempts by non-state actors quite frequently. People still want to have accountability within their small organisations.
In fact, in some ways, it's even more important.
Right. So
in a situation like that.
One of the things that people come across in the field, for example, are lists of issued weapons and names and rack numbers. It's actually a really interesting research source.
One of the other interesting elements of this sort of firearm is this continuous spectrum from one guy building something for his own sake, or just one guy building one gun, through to what almost become functional factories. Yeah. Even if they're small production, you do have shops that are making a whole lot of copies of the same weapon, and then a whole spectrum in between.
Yeah, I mean, we see everything from exactly the backyard developer, whether he's quite talented or not talented at all, right through to almost quasi-industrial production. And certainly some non-state actors, for example, have acquired some original purpose firearms production machinery and actually producing firearms parts to what would be an industrial spec, even if they haven't got the whole firearm. So
right, and then
there's a wide range of capability.
And I think it'd be interesting to look at some of the boundary cases where you get what was a non-state group, large and organized, putting together its own production facilities that becomes a functional nation state. What started as an underground, covert operation turns into a legitimate arms factory.
We see some of that, if not into a legitimate factory, certainly some of the models have been adopted into service officially in some of the Balkan states, for example.
Yeah, I was thinking Israel,
right,
as well. Okay. Some of the clandestine early Israeli gun manufacture turned into full-on real factories.
It's probably worth noting, I don't want to derail us into a legal or, God forbid, political discussion,
yes.
But having said that, we talked about the magazine and how it's so important. Mm-hmm. In Northern Ireland, well, put it this way, it's the only part of the UK where the magazine is a component part of the firearm.
Right.
And I suspect that's not
legally restricted.
Yeah, not a coincidence.
Right. Yeah. If you're trying to prevent people from making guns, and you can prevent them from getting their hands on factory-made magazines, that will make that job that much easier.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of factory-produced, we also have an interesting conversion. This isn't a homemade gun, but It didn't start off as a lethal firearm.
No, I guess the background on that really quickly is that we also spent a lot of time looking at not just these craft-produced and improvised weapons, but also those that are converted from either replica firearms, from less lethal or blank-firing firearms, and even sometimes from deactivated firearms. Firearms have gone through a deactivation process and then have been reactivated, so to speak. So they're also sources of weapons for criminal groups, for insurgent groups, and they vary by region. But I think we see a lot of them are quite regionally located. So in Libya, for example, a lot of Turkish blank-firing firearms are converted to lethal purpose use. In the UK, quite a few of these, and John knows the story behind this quite well, I think.
Yeah, thanks. I suppose the first thing to say, just to dovetail into what we just said, is that there is a craft-produced component to a lot of these. This is the most common criminal use firearm in the UK. These are widely publicised in the press when they're found.
When you say that, are you talking about Makarov specifically?
Well,
or converted?
I believe there are original purpose Makarovs out there, as indeed there are for other types, but when I say the most common, I mean the Baikal, usually the IZH 79, either 8 or 9.
Traumatic pistol, I think.
Yes.
A less lethal weapon.
I just want to get out of the way first of all this, because I can't tell you much about it anyway. These are certainly what the press call assassin kits. So you get the pistol, which I'll come to, in a little plastic gun case, possibly even the case that the pistol is sold in, I'm not sure, with one of these. And this is, as far as I know, entirely workshop produced. It's good for perhaps one shot. There's no real baffles in there. There's like a concentric tube drilled with holes. It will have some minor suppression effect, I'm sure, certainly for one shot, because there's a rubber block in the end of it. But anecdotally, we haven't testified one ourselves, but anecdotally, after one shot, they do lose substantial effect. And again, a threaded barrel.
Before you go further,
sure.
You two know what this term is, but I think it's going to be a new term for a lot of Americans watching. What is a traumatic pistol? It sounds to me, any pistol sounds traumatic to get shot with, but that's clearly a very specific term.
It's a term that's applied primarily to Eastern European designs and some other German and other designs, but really we're talking about less lethal weapons. In this case, they often fire a rubber ball cartridge. And sometimes they have irritant loads as well, like an OC powder, for example.
This is something that isn't really commercially sold in the United States.
No, I mean, it's not, with the prevalence of firearms in the US, it's not really got the market there. It's usually sold in areas where lethal purpose firearms are restricted. And some states still have an allowance for these kinds of less lethal.
This becomes a civilian self-defense option.
Right, and I should point out, of course, that they're still completely illegal in other states. So it's,
including the UK.
Including the UK, so it varies by country.
I should point that out anyway.
Sorry, Jonathan, I didn't want to interrupt you there, but
not a problem. As these are, that's a very good point. As these are imported, they are already prohibited weapons in the UK. I guess it's just easier to obtain for these groups things where they are legal, if that makes sense, even if they're bringing them in illegally in the first place. They then need to convert them. So these things they're made by Baikal, a legitimate firearms manufacturer, makes shotguns and all sorts of other things. The generic term Baikal has become common in the UK because these are a relatively common criminal weapon here. It's a Makarov PM. Almost, they're the guys making them for real now. And for that reason, materials may change over time because they don't necessarily have to bear the full pressure of a 9x18 cartridge or anything, but typically these are functionally real guns. That's why they're so attractive for conversion. There's no monkey metal to blow up. They're really solid things.
So what do they do to prevent you from simply loading? I mean, that magazine even looks like a standard 9x18 magazine. So presumably, when sold as a traumatic pistol, they've done something.
They have, and this is why this cuts to why they are illegal in the UK. Because to have such a thing as a blank firer, or we certainly can't have something firing rubber balls or irritants or whatever, but blank firing pistols are obtainable. They have to be absolutely blocked. They must vent at 90 degrees, either up or to the side. The barrel is completely blocked. It's essentially useless to the would-be criminal. Of course, with sufficient effort, you might be able to make it into something, but far better to...
With sufficient effort, you can make a gun out of nothing. So,
which of course
the argument,
is the argument exactly. So, sorry, we're getting a bit long-winded there, but essentially, in the original barrel of these things is a sort of spiral vein that allows the rubber bullet to spiral its way out of the barrel under pressure of firing. So, if you were able to chamber and fire a live round, it would be a bad day for you. Basically, that means that's not tungsten or anything like we're required to have in the UK. Break your drill bits and you cut the harder than the metal around it, you can just drill that out. And that's what they do. Certain more sophisticated groups are able to obtain basically bits of rifled barrel. and fit those.
But yeah, it's important to note that most examples of the improvised and craft-produced weapons we see in criminal usage or indeed in use with non-state actors and various armed groups around the world are non-rifled, they're smoothbore weapons.
Yes.
Which means their accuracy and their range, of course, are very limited.
Okay.
Yeah. But with sufficient resources and skill, and this is not insignificant, you can basically replace the barrel.
Right.
It's not something your average person
Yeah,
can
not
do,
trivial on a mock route because it's a fixed barrel to begin with.
Yeah.
But
and that's what
given that you can create a gun out of nothing but hardware store scrap.
Right.
this gives you a head start.
Right.
Yep. That's basically it. And the end result is a perfectly functional, somewhat reliable. Things like feed ramps and stuff will probably need finessing.
Right.
But it's basically a real gun.
Okay.
And of course, in this case, they have threaded the end for the suppressor.
Yeah. I mean, it's always a question of standards. We're saying, different standards that would be allowed in blank fires in the UK, say, versus blank fires in other countries. In fact, not even traumatic handguns, but even blank fires produced in Turkey. A number of the ones that we talked about being converted in Libya, most of those are, of course, forward venting rather than side or top venting.
Yeah.
For obvious reasons, simplicity of conversion. The same applies to deactivated firearms. So different standards by which firearms are deactivated in different states leads to, deactivated firearms from certain countries being vastly preferred by criminal groups or non-state actors for their reactivation potential. And so a deactivated firearm in the UK, for example, under the current specifications, is incredibly difficult to turn into anything useful, whereas a deactivated firearm from another country might be relatively easy.
A deactivated firearm in the United States only has to have its receiver destroyed, which leaves most of the pressure-bearing components still perfectly usable. And in fact, there is a legal and not thriving, but there's a legal community of people rebuilding destroyed machine guns into semi-automatic rifles in the United States.
Okay, there you go.
Which would not be legal to do in the UK
or
various other
many
places.
places.
most places. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, Nick, you're the primary author on a report that's coming out on exactly this sort of material, right?
Right. So, Ares staff have authored a report for the Small Arms Survey, a Geneva-based research organisation, looking at improvised and craft-produced weapons. And actually,
whoever contributed to that study must have been brilliant and fantastic.
Both Ian and John have contributed in their roles with Ares. And it's been, I think it's a pretty good guide for the layperson, introductory guide. It's pretty comprehensive. It goes through the major types that are seen around the world. It talks about some of the things we touched on today, like scale of manufacturing, types of manufacturing, skill and tool requirements, and so on. And then also we've got, a number of blog posts and a number of shorter pieces that have come out on some of the improvised, converted, reactivated, different sort of topics we've touched on today.
All right, very cool. So a good resource for anyone who is looking to
please check
find out about this type of material. And of course, we are sitting in the best gun collection in the Western world. Is it possible for people to come visit the NFC and study maybe this or maybe any other part of firearms history?
The facility is not open to the general public. Mm-hmm. We have a museum that people can come in for free.
It is a pretty cool museum.
Thank you.
It's the Royal Armouries Museum, right?
Yes, that's right. We also have the galleries at the Tower of London. We have an artillery museum in Portsmouth, near Portsmouth.
Ooh, I've never
probably
been to that
visit.
One. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have the public-facing side, and it's mostly on the historic side. Although I'm very keen to develop modern displays.
Okay.
Modern to us is like 1900 onward. But it is possible for individual researchers, bona fide researchers, to apply to us, and we will sort of assess you. And you can get in on an individual basis. And if you do, you can access all of the things that you've seen, laid out by class, by type, by country. And use it as a study resource, which is really what it's designed to be.
Wonderful. It's really cool that a collection like this can actually be available to researchers. I totally understand why you don't want to have the general public in here 24/7 handling everything, because it's the more interesting guns get, oftentimes you have to either put them away and leave them protected. Just not that people are wrong, it's just that a lot of handling has a negative effect on artifacts.
Absolutely, so, yeah. It's a balance.
You'll notice the gloves.
It's a balance we have to strike on the museum side, and then on the NFC side, if you like. We are not allowed to have group visits
Okay.
by civilians anyway.
Okay. There is a bit of bureaucracy involved, but if it's something that you're interested in, it is absolutely worth contacting them. The people here are really cool and very helpful and very knowledgeable, and I would strongly recommend it if it's something, if you're working on a book or any sort of bona fide research. Definitely come check them out. If you can't, of course, well, we have a whole video series coming up that we have filmed in here, so you'll be getting to take a look at a number of very cool guns from this trip, and hopefully there will be more in the future. Thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video, and make sure to check the description text below for links to a bunch of the different things we talked about today.